4 people dead, more than 370 structures gone, over 800,000 acres burned across a single state in a single season. And the fire that did the worst of it, the one that leveled an entire town in less than 12 hours, started because someone made a choice, not a lightning strike, not a downed power line sparking in dry grass. A human decision made on a day when every weather station in eastern Washington was screaming that no fire could be controlled once it started. By the end of this, you will understand exactly what investigators found, why this fire moved faster than any in the state's modern record, and the one atmospheric condition that turned a manageable ignition into a historic disaster. If this kind of coverage is useful to you, hit subscribe. We break down disaster events with the data and the context that the headlines leave out. 1 video a week. No hype, no speculation, just the science and the facts. Now, let us get into it. On the afternoon of August 6th, 2023, a wildfire ignited approximately 4 miles southwest of the town of Medical Lake, Washington. Medical Lake is a small community of roughly 5,000 people in Spokane County, situated between the city of Spokane to the east and the Scablands terrain to the west. The town sits at an elevation of about 2,300 feet, surrounded by rolling terrain covered in ponderosa pine, dry bunchgrass, and scattered rural properties connected by 2-lane roads that were never designed for mass evacuation. The fire was reported just after 2 in the afternoon local time. Within 30 minutes, it had crossed its first road. Within 90 minutes, it had entered the town. By midnight, Medical Lake had lost 265 homes, dozens of commercial structures, and the fire had burned through neighborhoods so fast that some residents never received an evacuation order before the flames reached their property line. That timeline deserves emphasis because it is the fact that separates this fire from every other fire in Washington's recent history. 90 minutes from ignition to structure loss. Most wildfires in the inland northwest take hours to build, sometimes days before they threaten populated areas. This one went from a single point of origin to inside a town before dinner. And the reason it could do that is not complicated. It is atmospheric. August 6th fell inside what the National Weather Service in Spokane had designated a red flag warning beginning that morning. Red flag warnings are not casual advisories. They are issued when the combination of low relative humidity, high temperatures, and sustained or gusting winds creates conditions under which any fire that starts will spread rapidly and resist suppression. The criteria for issuance in the Spokane forecast area are specific. Sustained winds above 25 miles per hour or gusts above 35, combined with relative humidity below 15% during a period when fuels are receptive to ignition. All 3 thresholds were exceeded on August 6th. On the afternoon in question, relative humidity across the Spokane County fire zone was between 8 and 12%. Temperatures were above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was the problem. A cold front was approaching from the northwest, and ahead of it, a pressure gradient tightened across the Columbia Basin. Surface winds that had been running at 10 to 15 miles per hour through the morning jumped to sustained speeds above 25 miles per hour by early afternoon, with gusts measured at individual stations exceeding 45 miles per hour. Those gusts arrived at the fire's location within the first hour of its existence. A fire that might have been containable at 10 miles per hour of wind became a fire that spotted half a mile ahead of itself at 45. Spotting is when burning embers are lofted into the wind column and deposited far ahead of the active flame front, igniting new fires that then grow back toward the original burn. Once a fire begins spotting at that distance, no ground crew can hold a line. The fire is no longer one fire. It is dozens, appearing simultaneously across a front that widens with every gust. The terrain did not help. The area southwest of Medical Lake is a mix of dry grassland, pine stands, and scattered rural properties with unmaintained defensible space. The grass had cured completely by late July. Fuel moisture readings taken that week from the nearest remote automated weather station showed live fuel moisture below 70% and dead fuel moisture below 5%. For context, 5% dead fuel moisture means the grass and duff on the ground are drier than kiln-dried lumber. At those levels, ignition requires almost no energy at all, and fire spread rates in grass fuels exceed 100 chains per hour, which translates to roughly 1.25 miles per hour even before wind is factored in. Add 45 mile per hour gusts, and the effective rate of spread in those fuels exceeds anything that ground resources can chase. Fire behavior analysts with the Washington Department of Natural Resources later confirmed that the Medical Lake fire exhibited what they classified as extreme fire behavior within its first hour, including long-range spotting, rapid rates of spread exceeding 2 miles per hour through grass and timber litter, and a convection column that collapsed at least once during the early evening, sending a pulse of outflow winds in all directions and temporarily pushing the fire in directions the prevailing wind alone would not have carried it. A collapsing convection column is what happens when the heat from a fire builds its own weather system, a towering cumulus of superheated air, and then the atmosphere above it destabilizes enough that the column falls back down. When that mass of hot air collapses, it hits the ground and radiates outward like a shock wave, carrying embers and heat in every compass direction. Multiple witnesses in Medical Lake reported a sudden wind shift followed by ember showers arriving from the south and east simultaneously, which is physically impossible under the prevailing northwest wind unless the column had collapsed. Firefighters on the ground described conditions they had never encountered in decades of service in eastern Washington, conditions more typical of the extreme fire environments seen in Australia or Southern California than the inland Northwest. Now, the cause. The Washington State Department of Natural Resources and the Spokane County Sheriff's Office conducted a joint origin and cause investigation that began within days of the fire being controlled. Origin and cause investigations follow a systematic methodology established by the National Wildfire Coordinating Group. Investigators work inward from the burned perimeter toward the point of lowest char, identifying the area of origin through physical indicators in the vegetation and soil, then examining that area for ignition sources. The indicators they follow are precise and physical. The direction grass stems lean after burning, the depth of charring on wooden fence posts, the side of rocks that shows soot accumulation, the angle at which brush is scorched. Each of these markers points back toward the origin like an arrow, and as investigators move inward, the arrows converge. The process is slow, methodical, and evidence-based. It took months. In February of 2024, the investigation concluded. The finding was unambiguous. The Medical Lake fire was human-caused. The determination was arson. The Spokane County Sheriff's Office arrested a suspect. The individual was identified as having been present in the area of origin at the time the fire started, and physical evidence recovered from the scene was consistent with deliberate ignition. The specific method of ignition has not been publicly detailed in full because of ongoing legal proceedings. But the investigators stated that the fire was intentionally set and that the suspect had no legitimate reason to be conducting any activity that would produce an open flame in that location on that day. Charges were filed, and then the case entered the court system, where it remains as of this recording. Set that finding against the conditions that existed that day, and the weight of it becomes clearer. This was not someone burning trash who lost control. This was not a campfire that escaped. This was a fire set on a day when the National Weather Service had publicly warned that any ignition would produce uncontrollable fire behavior. The person who set it did so into 45-mile-per-hour wind gusts, single-digit humidity, and temperatures above 100 degrees, adjacent to a populated town with limited evacuation routes. Whether the intent was to destroy Medical Lake specifically or whether the destruction was a consequence of recklessness beyond the ignition itself is a question the courts will resolve. But the physical outcome is not in dispute. 4 people died in the fires that burned across Spokane County that week. 265 homes in Medical Lake alone were destroyed. The town's water system was compromised. Its electrical infrastructure was burned through. Residents who evacuated came back to foundations and ash. Some of them had lived in those homes for 30 or 40 years. Everything they owned fit into whatever they had loaded into their vehicles in the 5 or 10 minutes they had before the flames arrived. The Medical Lake fire was not the only fire burning in Spokane County that day, and this detail matters for understanding both the response limitations and the broader atmospheric context. Within the same 24-hour window, the gray fire ignited east of Medical Lake, near the community of Airway Heights, burning an additional significant acreage and destroying more structures. Multiple smaller fires started across the county simultaneously. Fire agencies were overwhelmed by multiple ignitions occurring under identical extreme conditions, which meant that resources that might have been available to attack the Medical Lake fire in its first critical minutes were already committed or en route to other incidents. This is the compounding problem of extreme fire weather days. It is not just that each individual fire behaves worse. It is that multiple fires start simultaneously, because the conditions that make fires spread fast are the same conditions that make ignition easy. Every unextinguished cigarette, every dragging chain, every spark from equipment, every deliberate act, all of them have a higher probability of producing a sustained fire when humidity is 8% and wind is 45 miles per hour. The system cannot respond to all of them at once. Triage becomes necessary, and triage means some fires burn unattended in their first critical minutes, which is often the difference between a fire that stays small and one that destroys a town. On August 6th, Spokane County Fire Dispatch was receiving reports of new starts faster than they could assign units. The first engine that might have reached the Medical Lake fire in time was already committed to a grass fire 3 miles away. By the time resources were redirected, the Medical Lake fire had already begun spotting into the first residential streets on the town's western edge. Washington state had not experienced fire losses of this magnitude since the Yakult burn of 1902, which killed 38 people and burned over 238,000 acres across Clark, Skamania, and Cowlitz counties in the southwestern part of the state. In the modern era, meaning the era of organized wildland fire suppression, coordinated evacuation, and satellite-based detection, nothing in Washington had matched the 2023 season for combined structure loss, fatality count, and speed of onset. The closest comparison is the 2020 Labor Day fires in Oregon, which burned over 1 million acres in a single wind event and destroyed thousands of structures, also in a matter of hours rather than days. Both events share the same fundamental mechanism: extreme wind driving fire through communities faster than evacuation can proceed. The wind is always the variable that transforms a fire from a land management problem into a humanitarian disaster. Fuel load matters, drought matters, terrain matters. But the fires that kill people and destroy towns in the modern era almost universally share one feature. They occur on days of extreme wind. The Camp Fire in Paradise, California, in 2018. The Marshall Fire in Boulder County, Colorado, in 2021. The Lahaina Fire in Maui in 2023. The Medical Lake Fire in 2023. Different fuels, different terrain, different states, different causes. Same wind-driven, rapid onset pattern. Same result: communities overrun before they can evacuate. And this is where the investigation finding becomes something larger than a criminal case. If the Medical Lake Fire was arson, committed on a red flag warning day, then the question extends beyond individual culpability into systemic vulnerability, because the investigation also established that even without this specific ignition, the conditions that day were capable of producing the same outcome from any number of routine or accidental causes. A vehicle pulling off the highway, a power line contacting vegetation, a piece of farm equipment striking a rock, a lawnmower blade hitting gravel. Any of those would have produced a fire. The conditions guaranteed it. What the arsonist did was select the time and place, but the atmosphere was already loaded. The gun was cocked. Somebody pulled the trigger, but the gun was going to go off regardless. That is not a defense of the suspect. It is an indictment of the broader situation. Because here is the part nobody was talking about 6 months before this happened. Medical Lake had no community wildfire protection plan that addressed the speed of a wind-driven grass fire approaching from the southwest. The town's evacuation routes funnel through a small number of roads that were quickly overwhelmed with traffic. The notification systems, including wireless emergency alerts and local code red calls, went out after the fire had already entered the first neighborhoods. And the defensible space around many of the structures that burned was effectively zero, with dry grass growing directly against wooden fences and siding. None of that is unusual. It describes hundreds of communities across the inland Northwest, towns that were built in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, when wildfire was not understood as a structural threat, surrounded by fuels that have become increasingly flammable as the climate has warmed and dried, with infrastructure that assumes fires will be caught and suppressed before they reach the built environment. That assumption held for decades. It does not hold anymore, not on days like August 6th. The suppression-first model of wildfire management, which worked well enough in the 20th century when fire seasons were shorter and fuel loads were lower, has run into a wall. Fires now start under conditions where initial attack is physically impossible, and communities that relied on that initial attack as their primary defense have no backup plan. The atmospheric setup that produced the Medical Lake fire was not unprecedented. It was not even rare. The combination of a cold front passage, prefrontal wind acceleration, record heat, and critically low humidity occurs multiple times per fire season across the inland Northwest. What made 2023 different was that an ignition occurred at the worst possible time, in the worst possible location, under the worst possible conditions. But worst possible conditions now arrive more frequently than they did 30 years ago. Climate data from the Western Regional Climate Center shows that the number of days per year with relative humidity below 15% in the Spokane area has increased by approximately 12 days per year compared to the $19.80 to 2000 baseline. Average August temperatures have risen by approximately 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit over the same period. And critically, the fire season, defined as the period during which large fire growth is possible, has extended by roughly 30 days on both ends compared to the 1970s. Fire seasons that once ran from mid-July through mid-September now begin in late June and extend into October. That extension means more days of exposure, more days when an ignition can produce extreme outcomes, more rolls of the dice. And the dice are loaded heavier every year by the same warming trend that is drying the fuels faster and keeping them dry longer. The investigators found the cause. The courts will determine the punishment. but the conditions that allowed one deliberate ignition to destroy a town in 90 minutes are not being tried in any courtroom. They are structural, they are atmospheric, and they are worsening. Let us talk about what has changed since the fire and what has not. Medical Lake began rebuilding in the spring of 2024. As of this recording, some residents have returned to new or repaired structures. Others have not. Many have left permanently, relocating to Spokane or elsewhere, unable to afford rebuilding or unwilling to rebuild in a place that demonstrated so clearly how quickly everything can be lost. The economic disruption to a community of 5,000 people losing 265 homes cannot be overstated. Property values, insurance availability, municipal tax revenue, school enrollment, local business viability, all of it was disrupted in a single afternoon. The town's commercial district lost businesses that had served the community for decades, and the jobs those businesses provided disappeared with the structures that housed them. Insurance companies have since begun restricting new policies in fire-adjacent areas of Spokane County, a pattern already well documented in California but newer to Washington and Oregon. The downstream effects of that restriction are still unfolding. Homeowners who want to rebuild are finding that coverage is either unavailable or priced at levels that make rebuilding financially irrational. Washington State passed legislation in the 2024 session aimed at expanding defensible space requirements around structures in the wildland-urban interface. The bill requires property owners within designated zones to maintain a minimum buffer of non-combustible space around their homes, clearing vegetation within a specified radius, and using fire-resistant materials for fencing, decking, and siding within certain distances of the structure. Enforcement mechanisms remain underfunded, and the fundamental geometry of many eastern Washington communities, where homes sit in dry grass with narrow road access and no secondary evacuation routes, has not changed. The legislation addresses the problem in principle. Whether it addresses it in practice, before the next red flag warning day arrives, is a different question entirely. The Washington Department of Natural Resources increased pre-positioning of suppression resources during red flag warning periods beginning in the 2024 season. Additional engine crews and aviation assets were staged in eastern Washington during high-risk weather windows. The stated goal is faster initial attack during the first critical minutes of a new ignition. Whether that faster response would have made a difference on August 6, 2023, given the wind speeds and multiple simultaneous starts, is an open question. The honest answer from fire behavior specialists is probably not. Not at 45-mile-per-hour gusts, not at 8% humidity, not with long-range spotting. The fire was beyond initial attack capability within its first 20 minutes under those conditions. The physics of fire spread in those fuels at those wind speeds simply outpaces the logistics of getting equipment and personnel to a new start. And that brings us to the uncomfortable conclusion that the investigation itself points toward without stating explicitly. The Medical Lake fire was caused by arson. That is a fact established by trained investigators using physical evidence and systematic methodology. The arsonist bears legal responsibility for the deaths and destruction that followed, but the vulnerability that allowed one match to destroy a town exists independent of who struck it. It is built into the landscape, the climate trajectory, the building patterns, and the emergency notification timelines. The National Weather Service issued the red flag warning 12 hours before the fire started. The warning was correct. The conditions materialized exactly as forecast, and a town burned anyway. The warning did what a warning can do. It told people the conditions were dangerous. What it could not do is prevent an ignition from occurring or stop a fire from moving at 2 miles per hour through a community that had 90 minutes of warning at best. So here's what to actually watch going forward in eastern Washington and across the inland Northwest. First, watch the wind forecasts during fire season, not just the fire weather outlooks. The specific signal that precedes events like Medical Lake is a cold front approaching from the northwest with a tightening pressure gradient producing prefrontal wind acceleration. When the National Weather Service issues a red flag warning with wind gusts forecast above 35 miles per hour and humidity below 15%, that is the atmospheric configuration that produces town-destroying fire behavior. Those days occur between 3 and 8 times per fire season in the Spokane area. Each one is a loaded gun. Second, watch the insurance market. The availability and affordability of homeowners insurance in fire-prone areas of Washington and Oregon is changing rapidly. Companies are withdrawing from markets where the modeled loss exposure exceeds their risk tolerance. As coverage becomes harder to obtain, property values in the wildland-urban interface will adjust, and communities will face difficult decisions about building codes, fuel management, and land use that they have historically deferred. Third, watch the legal outcome. The Medical Lake arson case, if it results in conviction, will establish precedent for how Washington State treats wildfire arson committed during extreme fire weather conditions. The distinction between starting a fire on a calm, humid day and starting one during a red flag warning, when the act is functionally equivalent to detonating an incendiary device in a populated area, is one the courts have not fully addressed at this scale in this state. A conviction carrying penalties proportional to the destruction caused would send a clear signal about the legal consequences of ignition during extreme fire weather. And fourth, watch the rebuild. How Medical Lake rebuilds, what materials are used, what setbacks are required, what vegetation management is enforced, and whether the rebuilt community is more survivable than the one that burned, will serve as a template for dozens of similar communities across eastern Washington facing identical exposure. If Medical Lake rebuilds to the same standards that allowed it to burn in 90 minutes, with the same fuels, the same access limitations, and the same notification gaps, then nothing has been learned. And the next red flag warning day will carry the same potential it carried on August 6th. The investigation answered the question of how this fire started. The answer was deliberate human action on the worst possible day in a community that had no margin for error. The conditions that made 90 minutes enough time to destroy 265 homes are not conditions anyone can arrest or prosecute. They are the new baseline. And the only honest summary is the one the fire scientists keep arriving at. The fires that destroy towns in this era are not the fires that burn the most acres. They are the fires that start on the wrong day, in the wrong place, with the wrong wind behind them. Medical Lake was all three at once. We will continue tracking the legal proceedings and the policy response as they develop. When this case reaches resolution, you will hear about it here,